There were 6 trained men in that room. None of them moved. She did. The gun was out for less than 3 seconds before she crossed the distance between the service door and the man standing in the center of the room. And in those 3 seconds, 6 trained bodyguards did the calculation that trained bodyguards do. Threat assessment, angle, proximity, collateral, and not one of them moved fast enough. And the woman carrying a catering tray of water glasses covered the 12 feet between her and the target in the time it took any of them to finish the calculation. And she hit the man low and sideways with her full weight, which was considerable, and took him off his feet and behind the column at the south end of the room before the shot went wide and took out the window. Behind where he'd been standing, she had not calculated anything. She had simply moved. The man she had just saved lay flat on the marble floor with his back against the column and her body between him and the room. And he was looking at the side of her face, and she was looking at the door where the shooter had been. And her expression was not fear, and it was not adrenaline, and it was not the particular wild-eyed shock of someone who had just done something they didn't understand. It was concentration, pure and complete and utterly focused, like a woman who had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury and that the body did better work without it. "Stay down," she said to the most dangerous man in the city. In the same tone someone might use to tell a child not to touch a hot stove. He stayed down. He would think about that. Later, the fact that he had stayed down, the fact that the word had landed in him with the weight of an instruction from someone whose authority over the situation he had not questioned for even a fraction of a second, which had never happened to him before in his life. Not since he was 19 years old and building something out of nothing, and the world still had the capacity to surprise him. He was 37 now. The world had not surprised him in a long time. Her name was Celeste Mora. She was 26 years old. She had been working the catering shift at the Eldino Hotel for 4 hours when the gun came out, and she had been a catering server for 3 years, and before that she had been a nursing student for 2 years before she had to leave the program when her mother got sick and the money ran out. Poor she had been a man of... And she had spent every day since then quietly doing the math on how to get back in, on how to close the gap between where she was and where she had been going before the world interrupted. And she had not, in any version of that math, and in any arrangement of those numbers, included the possibility of throwing herself across a marble floor to protect a stranger from a bullet. She had not planned it. There was no version of that moment in which she had made a choice. There was only the gun and the man who hadn't seen it yet, and her body moving before her mind had finished forming the thought. That was the whole of it. That was who she was. She found this out about herself at 26, on a marble floor, with water glasses shattered around her and 6 bodyguards finally in motion around her and the man she had just saved, breathing hard against her shoulder. His name was Rafael Vega, and she had no idea who he was. And that was the last moment in her life that would be true. 3 months earlier, Celeste Mora had been doing the math in the back of a catering van at 6 in the morning, the familiar arithmetic of a woman who has been holding things together for long enough that the calculation has become background noise, constant, quiet, never fully resolved. Her mother's medications, the rent on the 2 bedrooms they shared in the east end of the city, the one with the water pressure problem, and the neighbor who played the same 3 songs on repeat after midnight. Her own student loan payments, which had not paused when the program did and would not pause until she found a way back in, which required money, which required the shifts she was currently working, which required the van she was currently sitting in at 6 in the morning doing the math on all of it. She was good at the math. She was good at most things that required sustained attention and the willingness to stay with a problem after other people had decided it wasn't worth the effort. She had been told this in ways both kind and unkind her whole life. The teacher who had pulled her aside at 12 and said, "You have a mind that doesn't quit," which had felt like the best thing anyone had ever said to her, and the advisor at the nursing program who had reviewed her file after she requested the leave of absence and said it would be a shame, genuinely, and meant it. And Celeste had nodded and said she'd be back, and meant that too. She was going to be back. The math was just taking longer than expected to resolve. She was also at 26, built in a way that the world had opinions about, large and soft and shaped in the manner of a woman who occupied space generously and had long ago made a private necessary peace with the fact that rooms had feelings about that before she'd said a word in them. She had done her grieving about it at 17, when it became clear that the feelings weren't temporary and the world wasn't changing, and she had come out the other side of that grief with something harder and more useful than resentment, which was the understanding that the only thing she had ever fully controlled was the quality of her attention, the honesty of her work, and that those two things, done consistently, had always eventually been enough. She told herself this on the bad days. On the good days, she didn't need to tell herself anything. The catering company paid adequately and scheduled reliably and asked nothing of her except to be professional and punctual and to carry things efficiently, all of which she did without difficulty. She liked the work in the flat, practical way. She liked most work, not because it was her calling, but because she was good at it, and being good at something had its own quiet satisfaction, regardless of what the something was. She had been assigned to the Aldino Hotel for the past 6 weeks, corporate events mostly. Dinner service for conferences and board meetings and the occasional private party on the upper floors. She had learned the layout of the hotel well enough to move through it without looking at the floor plan, had developed the particular spatial efficiency of someone who carries things for a living, the path that cuts 3 steps off the route from the kitchen to the east dining room, the service elevator that ran 2 minutes faster than the main bank, the door at the north end of the ballroom that opened outward, if you hit it at the right angle with your hip. She had been carrying a tray of water glasses from that service door into the private dining room on the 14th floor when the man with the gun stepped out from behind the bar cart and everything changed. She did not know the name of the man standing in the center of the room. She did not know, carrying that tray through the service door, that the private dinner on the 14th floor was a meeting between Rafael Vega and 3 men from an allied family, a meeting that had been arranged with enough discretion that only 8 people in the city should have known it was happening. She did not know that someone who should not have known had known anyway. She knew only the gun and the man and the distance between them, and the fact that nobody else was moving. The aftermath of those 3 seconds took shape around her in the slow, strange way that aftermath always does. The particular quality of time after something irreversible, where the world reorganizes itself around the new fact of what just happened and you are standing in the center of the reorganization, trying to catch up to it. The shooter was down. She didn't know exactly when that had happened. Somewhere in the seconds after she hit the floor while she was still between the man and the door, one of the bodyguards had finally moved. She registered this information and set it aside. The man beside her was sitting up, was unhurt. She could see that the assessment was automatic, professional, the nursing student's eye that had never fully gone back to sleep. No blood, no impact, breathing controlled, though his chest was moving faster than it would have been a minute ago. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He was dark-haired and broad-shouldered and had the kind of face that had been arranged by years of bearing weight into something settled and certain, with dark eyes that were currently doing something she couldn't fully read, something between assessment and something older than assessment. Something that was looking at her the way you look at a thing you can't yet explain. "You're not hurt," she said, the first thing out of her mouth, which was not a question. "No," he said. "Are you?" She took stock. Her left knee had hit the marble hard. She could feel it already, the specific deep bruise that would announce itself properly in about 6 hours. Her right hand had gone down to break the fall and was scraped, but not broken. "Nothing significant," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "You came from the service door," he said. "I was carrying water glasses," she said. "There were glass fragments around them both. Some of them didn't make it." Something moved through his expression. Not quite the beginning of a smile, the place where a smile would be if this were a different kind of moment. "Rafael Vega," he said, and waited. The name meant nothing to her. She filed that away as her own ignorance rather than his irrelevance. "Celeste Mora," she said. "I should check on the rest of the room." She got up, because the room still needed checking, and she was still the person who had just assessed that nobody else was doing it. And she moved through it with the same focused efficiency she had walked into it with, checking on the 3 men who had been seated at the table. none of whom appeared to be physically harmed, and the two bodyguards who had finally moved and were now standing over the man on the floor with a competence that had arrived about 15 seconds later than it should have. She was aware doing this that every eye in the room was following her. She was accustomed to being followed by eyes in rooms. Usually, it was a different kind of attention. This was something she didn't have a category for yet. When she turned around, Rafael Vega was on his feet watching her. He had not called for anyone. He had not made a single call or given a single instruction. He was just watching her move through the room, with the expression of a man who had found something he hadn't been looking for and was trying to work out what to do about the finding. "Where do you think you're going?" he said when she moved toward the service door. "Back to the kitchen," she said. "I still have a shift. Just saved my life," he said. "I know," she said. "Your people can debrief you on the rest. I need to let the kitchen know I'm coming back without the water glasses." She left. She thought about it on the van ride home at midnight, the way she thought about everything. Carefully, without rushing to a conclusion, turning it over until she understood the shape of it. She had moved toward a gun. She had done it without thinking, and she had done it without regret, and she had done it the same way she did everything that mattered, because it was simply what needed to happen, and she was the person who was there. She did not think of herself as brave. Brave implied a choice made against fear. She had not been afraid, she had been present. Her knee hurt. She noted this and went to sleep. The kitchen supervisor called her the next morning to tell her, with an awkwardness that told her something was being left out of the telling, that her services at the Aldino Hotel were no longer required. She absorbed this. She asked if there had been a complaint. "Not exactly," the supervisor said. Then, "What exactly?" she said. "The client has requested that you not return," the supervisor said. "That's all I was told." She spent 4 hours being quietly, thoroughly angry about this, in the efficient way she was angry about things. She let it run its full course inside her, and didn't perform it for anyone. And at the end of 4 hours, she felt it drain to a residue, and she went online and began looking for other catering work. She did not connect the instruction to Rafael Vega. She assumed it was hotel management, covering liability, protecting themselves from the event of the previous night in whatever way hotels protected themselves. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. The man who knocked on her apartment door 2 days later was not what she expected when she opened it. He was enormous, first of all, not Raphael's particular kind of broad and still, but massive, in the way of a man whose size was a professional specification, with a face that had clearly done some hard work in its time, and a black suit that cost more than her monthly rent. "MS Mora," he said, with a formality that sat slightly oddly on a man of his dimensions. "My name is Sandro. I work for Rafael Vega. He would like to speak with you." "He had me fired from my catering job," she said. Sandro had the grace to look faintly uncomfortable. "He would like to explain that. In person, if you're willing." She thought about it for a moment. The calculation that any sensible person would make about getting into a car because a very large man knocked on their door. "How did he find my address?" she said. "He has resources," Sandro said. "That's not reassuring." "No," Sandro agreed. "It isn't. I apologize for that," she decided, based on nothing more scientific than the quality of the apology, which had been genuine to go. The house was not what she expected, which had been something aggressively opulent, the visual vocabulary of power she had built from films and news articles. What she found instead was large and old, with the particular quiet of a place that had been inhabited seriously rather than decorated for effect, dark wood and high ceilings and the smell of coffee, and something that might have been a library somewhere in the interior of it. There were men at the perimeter. She counted 4 on the way in. But the house itself had the unexpected quality of something that belonged to a person rather than a position. Rafael Vega was in a room off the main hall, standing at a window with his back to the door when Sandro brought her in, and he turned around when she walked in and looked at her with the same expression she had filed away from the floor of the Aldino Hotel, the assessing, unexplained quality that she still didn't have a category for. "You had me fired," she said, before he could open with whatever he had prepared. "I had your contract reassigned," he said. "You'll find a new placement offer from the agency this afternoon. Better rate." better hours. I should have arranged that before you found out about the Aldino. I'm sorry. She processed this. Why? She said. Because the Aldino is a location I use, he said, and what happened 2 nights ago means it is no longer a location I can use safely, which means I needed you not to be there. He paused. For your own protection. You could have explained that instead of just having my assignment changed. Yes, he said, that was a mistake in judgment. I'm accustomed to arranging things rather than explaining them. How is that working out for you? She said. The corner of his mouth did something. Apparently not as well as I thought. She sat down, because she had decided to, in the chair across from where he was standing, and she looked at him directly the way she looked at everything. And she said, What do you want, Mr. Vega? To understand something. He said, What? There were 6 men in that room whose entire function is to move between me and a threat, he said. None of them moved in time. You moved. I need to understand why. I don't know, she said. I just moved. That's not an explanation. I know, he said. It's the only one I have. I saw what was happening, and my body made the decision before I did. That's the whole of it. He looked at her for a long moment. You weren't afraid, he said. Not in that moment. No. Most people are. I know, she said. I don't always understand why I'm different about it. I just am. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away. I'd like to offer you something, he said. I don't want money, she said immediately. I know, he said, which surprised her. I looked into you. I know you're trying to get back into a nursing program. I know why you left. I know what the gap costs. He paused. I'm not offering money. I'm offering a position. She waited. I need someone close to me who isn't performing a role, he said. Every person in my organization is doing a job, which means every person is, to some degree, managing how they appear in relation to that job. I have 6 bodyguards who are running calculations while you are already moving. The calculations are correct. They're also slower. He looked at her steadily. I'm not offering you a bodyguard position. I'm offering you a role as an advisor and facilitator, close proximity, accompanying me to meetings and events, and the flexibility to finish your nursing qualification on a schedule you control, in exchange for being present and being exactly who you already are. She stared at him. You want to hire me, she said, because I moved without thinking. I want to hire you, he said, because in a room full of people doing their jobs, you were the only one doing the right thing. Those are not always the same thing. I need someone who can tell the difference. She thought about it for a long time, long enough that the room stayed quiet, and he let it, which told her something about him. I have conditions, she said. Name them. My mother's care is not touched by anything that happens in your world. She stays separate. Done. I continue my nursing qualification. If a conflict arises between your schedule and my program, the program wins. A pause. Brief. Done. And I will tell you the truth even when it's not what you want to hear, she said. I don't know how to do anything else. If that becomes a problem, you tell me and I'll leave. If you ever tell me a truth I don't want to hear, he said, and I treat it as a problem, you have my permission to remind me of this conversation. She thought about it one more time, quickly, the final pass of assessment. Okay, she said. The world she walked into was not the world she had built in her imagination. She had expected, going in, something cinematic and brutal, the visual language of the life she had been told. People like Rafael Vega lived, the constant violence and the hierarchy of fear, and the men who smiled only when something bad was being decided. She had steeled herself for it the way she steeled herself for things that were going to be difficult, directly, without flinching, with the understanding that difficult was not the same as impossible. What she found was more complicated and stranger and, in its own way, harder to navigate than violence would have been, because the world she had stepped into was a world of information. of what people said and didn't say, of what rooms meant and what agreements covered, and what the specific texture of a silence between two men who had known each other for 20 years could tell you about who was actually in control of the conversation. It was a world of relationships, and she had walked into it with nothing but her own attention, and she discovered in the first 2 weeks that her attention was apparently the only instrument she needed. She went with him to meetings. She sat slightly behind and to the side of him. Not at the table, but not at the wall either. In the particular middle position of someone whose function was ambiguous enough that people stopped performing for her within about 20 minutes and started simply being themselves. Because they couldn't categorize her well enough to know what performance she required. She watched everything. She said very little. She noticed the things people did when they thought they were not being watched. The glance that lasted a half-second too long. The hand that moved to the jacket pocket and then didn't. The way a man's shoulders settled differently when the conversation shifted from what he wanted to discuss to what he didn't. After each meeting, she told Raphael what she had seen. Not analysis. She wasn't experienced enough in this world to analyze yet, but description, precise, detailed, in order. What she had observed. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and the first time she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "You saw 4 things I missed. You were running the meeting," she said. "You couldn't watch everything." "I have people whose job it is to watch everything," he said. "They're watching for threats," she said. "I was watching for people." He looked at her. "What's the difference?" "Threats are things that might happen," she said. "People are things that are already happening." He hired a new security analyst the following week, which she understood was related to that conversation, and which she filed as information about the kind of man he was, one who updated when he was given a reason to. The cruelty arrived at a dinner she had not known was going to be a test until it was already underway. It was a formal dinner at the Marchetti estate. Old family, old money. The kind of wealth that had been accumulating long enough to have forgotten what it started as and remembered only what it currently was. Raphael had brought her as his accompanying associate, which was a designation that gave the room very little information, and therefore maximum opportunity to fill the gap with its own assumptions. The assumptions arrived in the form of Julia Marchetti, who was 45 and beautiful, and had the particular cruelty of a woman who had spent her life being valued for her appearance and had decided, consciously or not, that this gave her the right to assess other people by the same standard and find them wanting. She found Celeste wanting within the first 3 minutes. She communicated this across the dinner table with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing it her whole life. The look that started at the face and moved downward and came back up with a verdict already rendered. The comment about the seating arrangement that wasn't about the seating arrangement. The remark addressed to the table generally that managed with the precision of long practice to exclude Celeste specifically. And then, dessert service. When the table had loosened enough for the kind of comment that disguised itself as observation. "Raphael, I have to say, you surprise me. Your taste has always been. So, the pause, calibrated, particular. I suppose we all find what suits us." The table went quiet. In the way tables do when something has just been said that everyone understood and nobody is going to name directly. Celeste set down her fork. She looked at Julia Marchetti across the table, with the complete, steady attention she brought to everything, and she said, "Particular is a kind word. I'd say he has good instincts, the kind that don't get distracted by surface. A beat. Though I understand," she added pleasantly, "that instincts like that can be hard to read from the outside." The table absorbed this. Julia Marchetti absorbed this, which took a moment longer, because it had landed exactly where it was aimed, and the aim had been accurate. Raphael did not look at Celeste. She was aware of him not looking at her, which was its own kind of look, the controlled, deliberate not turning that meant he had registered everything and was managing his response. Later in the car, he said, "You didn't flinch." "She wasn't worth a flinch," Celeste said. "She's been saying things like that her whole life," he said, "to a lot of people." "I know," she said. "I could tell. Practice makes it smooth, but it doesn't make it less obvious." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have let it go," he said. I could have, she agreed. Why didn't you? She thought about it. Because letting it go would have meant agreeing with her premise, she said. I don't agree with her premise. I see no reason to pretend otherwise. He turned and looked at her in the dark of the car, and the expression on his face was the one she was starting to recognize. The particular quality of his attention when it had located something it was going to keep coming back to. No, he said quietly. Neither do I. The threat came from inside, as it always does in worlds built on loyalty, because loyalty is the most valuable currency in those worlds and therefore the most counterfeited. His name was Dario, and he had been Raphael's second for 6 years. And he was the reason the meeting at the Aldino Hotel had been compromised, though Celeste didn't know this yet. What she knew, 2 months into her role, was that something about Dario's behavior in rooms had been registering in her observations log as inconsistent. Small things, the kind that didn't add up to anything definitive until you had enough of them and could see the pattern. The way his attention moved in meetings when certain routes were discussed. The way he handled his phone in a specific manner when he thought he was behind other people's sightlines. The way his voice calibrated itself differently when Raphael was present versus when he was not. Not differently in the way all voices calibrated around authority, but differently in the way voices calibrate around guilt. She wrote it down. She looked at it for 3 days. She added to it. She looked at it again. On the 4th day, she went to Raphael's study and closed the door and sat across from him and said, I need you to look at something and tell me if I'm wrong. She put the notebook in front of him. He read it. He read it again. Where did you get this? He said. I've been writing down what I observe in meetings, she said. I've been doing it since I started. This is the pattern I found in Dario's observations over 8 weeks. The silence that followed was of the kind that exists after a piece of information has arrived, and the person receiving it is integrating it rather than responding to it. You've been keeping observation logs since you started, he said. You hired me to pay attention, she said. I paid attention. He looked at her. And you came to me with this. Instead of what? She said. Instead of going to anyone else with it. Instead of waiting to see what happened. Instead of deciding it wasn't your problem. It is my problem, she said. I'm in this room. Everything in this room is my problem. He was very still for a moment. The particular stillness she had come to understand meant he was feeling something more strongly than he intended to show. I need to verify this, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to act on my notebook. I'm telling you what I saw so you can verify it yourself. That's all. What happened in the 48 hours after that conversation was largely invisible to her, the kind of investigation that happened in the architecture of a world she was still learning to read. What surfaced on the other side of it was the confirmation that Dario had been feeding information to the same organization that had sent the shooter to the Aldino Hotel and had been doing it for 4 months, and that the attack at the Aldino had been possible because of information only Dario could have provided. The night the confrontation happened, Celeste was in the building. Raphael had asked her to stay. Not in the room where it would happen. He was not, she understood, a man who needed a witness to what had to be done, but in the building, which she understood meant she was the thing that was keeping him tethered to a version of himself that could return from what he was about to do and still be the man she knew. She sat in the kitchen and drank tea and waited. She heard at one point raised voices from somewhere in the interior of the house. She did not go toward them. She stayed where she was and kept her hands around the mug and thought about her mother and her nursing program and the particular quality of a man who had told her she could tell him truths he didn't want to hear and had meant it. When Raphael came back into the kitchen 2 hours later, he was unhurt, and his expression was the one she had seen on the Aldino floor, the settled certain face of a man who had just done a hard thing and paid its full cost and was still standing. He sat down across from her. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't do anything tonight," she said. "You did everything," he said. 2 months ago. 8 weeks of notebooks. He looked at her steadily. "You have been paying attention to my world with more care than people who have been in it for years," It's what you hired me for, she said. It's not, he said. I hired you because you moved without calculating. What you've done since is something else, something I didn't know I needed. He was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you what I see? She nodded. See a woman who has been underestimated every day of her life, he said slowly, like he was choosing each word with the care it deserved, and who decided at some point that the answer to being underestimated was not to become visible in the way the world wanted, but to become indispensable in the way that actually mattered. You don't perform, you don't manage, you just see things clearly, without interference from ego or fear or the need to be seen seeing them. He paused. Do you know how rare that is? I know how often it gets ignored, she said. Yes, he said. I know. I ignored it for 45 seconds on a floor in the Aldino Hotel, and a woman in a catering uniform corrected me. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the first time he had touched her since the floor, and his hand was warm and deliberate and very still. I have spent 15 years building something that runs on the judgment of people I can trust. I have trusted very few of them completely. I trust you completely. I don't know what to do with that except tell you. She looked at him. The full, steady, honest weight of her attention. You could start, he said, by not being surprised by it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face came undone, very slightly, in the way that things come undone in people who have been careful for a very long time, when something finally makes the careful unnecessary. I'm not surprised, he said. I was. I'm not anymore. Good, she said, and turned her hand over under his and held it, which was a simple thing and a complete one. 6 months later, Celeste Mora was in her second semester back in the nursing program, on a schedule she controlled, with a supervisor who had welcomed her return with a warmth that told her she had been missed in the specific way that genuinely capable people are missed. She was 2 days a week on the hospital floor and 3 days in Raphael's world, and the balance between them was strange and complicated and entirely surprisingly hers. The Marchetti dinner had become, in the months since, a minor legend in the social circles that attended such things, not because of what Julia Marchetti had said, but because of the woman who had answered her and the way Rafael Vega had looked at that woman in the car afterward, which 2 people had witnessed, and neither of them had managed to describe accurately except to say that they had never seen him look at anyone like that before. Julia Marchetti had not been invited to anything in his orbit since. This had been noticed. Nothing had been said. At a family dinner 3 months in, Raphael's uncle, a man of 70 with the eyes of someone who had been in this world since before Raphael was born and had developed over those decades, the specific unsparing clarity of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by very little, had looked at Celeste across the table for a long moment and then said to Raphael without ceremony, "This one sees things." "Yes," Raphael said. "Keep her," his uncle said, and went back to his food. Celeste, who had heard this, said nothing. She filed it. He thought about it later, in the quiet of a night that had rearranged itself into something she hadn't planned and hadn't predicted, and she thought about 6 trained men who had run their calculations, and a woman who had simply moved, and the extraordinary, unlikely chain of events that had followed from that single moment of unreasoned, uncalculated. Completely characteristic action. She was a fortress. She was the thing nobody saw coming. She was the woman who had spent her whole life being told that the space she took up was a problem, and who had decided somewhere along the way that the space she took up was the exact amount required for the person she actually was, and who had walked into a marble room with a tray of water glasses and, in 3 seconds, changed the entire direction of her life by doing the only thing she had ever known how to do. The right thing, without calculating, because she was there. If this story reminded you that the people who move without calculating are always the ones who change everything, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, has there ever been a moment where you acted before you thought and it turned out to be the best thing you ever did?